Today, we officially begin discussing the reading questions, starting with the multiple choice ones. Yes, I'm putting the choose single answer and choose multiple answers together, and I don't plan on telling you which it is for each question prior to our analysis. Don't hate me for doing this, I do have a very good reason. When we talk strategy, of course we'll be treating these questions differently. However, in this series, we will focus a lot more on the comprehension part, so it makes no difference when we go through all the options individually and analyze why each is correct or false. I genuinely believe this is a good way for you guys to improve on reading, so I'll take the test-taking shenanigans out of the equation for now. Let's look at the two types of reading multiple choice questions. You will get 2 to 3 questions for each type during the test. The choose multiple answers passages are typically a bit longer, but there's no guarantee. The choose single answer is very intuitive to understand. You read the question, go through the passage, and then pick an answer that you like. For choose multiple answers, however, the choices should be made a bit more carefully. We know for a fact that there is more than one correct answer among them all, so there will be at least 2. Occasionally, you will be given more options, say 6 to 7. And usually in this case, there exists a third correct answer. What is commonly speculated about these questions is the fact that the correct options will not be more than half of the total options, which is reasonable. Pearson obviously don't want someone to just tick every option and then still be able to get something out of it. A little more about how you should approach choose multiple answers. We know by now that if a wrong option is picked, it will deduct points. This has led to a popular strategy taught by many agencies. Even for choose multiple answers, you should only pick one option. The argument is that if you force out choice number 2 and it happens to be wrong, not only will you be given a 0, you are wasting precious time that could have been spent on other questions. This is somewhat of a good approach, unlike what they usually do at agencies. However, just as always, I would like to present a different strategy. In order to explain my recommendation a little better, let's look at how much time you should spend on each question. Averagely speaking, you should spend about a minute and a half on these multiple choice questions, slightly longer for the choose multiple answers version. We know that on average, we have 2 minutes per question, so this is considering the fact that other questions are more worthwhile of your energy and attention. Do not give them up completely just so you can have 5 minutes on one fill in the blanks question. It's not worth it. Now that we have established a time frame, it is a good place to start making references. Spending a minute and a half on choose single answer is usually a good practice, even though some passages are significantly more difficult than others, so we are purely talking averages here. As for choose multiple answers, you have to factor in the potential amount of points that you're giving up by only choosing one option. In the uncommon but not impossible scenario that you have 3 correct options in a question, choosing one basically means you are forfeiting 2/3 of the possible score, which is just not a good trade. My suggestion is very simple. You should go for 2 options, provided you haven't spent an unreasonable amount of time on it already. Of course, you need to be quite certain to make the call, or otherwise you're just gambling with your points, which is never a smart idea, especially for PTE. Remember that the time you have already spent on and prior to this question will heavily affect your decision on whether you should dwell upon one particular question. A very common pitfall for multiple choice questions in both the reading and listening parts is how the options sometimes use the exact same phrasing as the original text. This poses a big problem for students who can't truly comprehend the passage, and they have to resort to looking for familiar words that they have seen before. This almost never works for PTE because almost all of the options use some of the exact words from the passage. This means that the options with the exact same choices of words can very well be wrong just as any other options, so don't rely on that as a viable strategy to determine any option's correctness. An opposite extreme is also something that you should pay attention to. Most reading and listening comprehension asks you to interpret, not to infer. This means that you should try not to add in information that was not made obvious by the passages, even if it seems to make logical sense. This tells you that if the options bring up something that was not directly discussed in the passage, it's probably not a good pick. Remember to try and keep your subjective judgments out of the process and only take the words for their literal meaning. Before we jump into the actual questions, there's one minor detail that I would like to discuss. It's the order of how you do things for such questions. Usually, I will read the question, then the text, and lastly, the given options. Reading the question first allows me to look for specific tones, information, and details while skipping over others that are trivial, so I can save a ton of time and answer the questions correctly, oftentimes without reading the whole passage. Then why read the options last? This is how I like to recommend students to mitigate the previously mentioned problem, how students might end up just picking something familiar. Usually, when students read the options first, the moment they see something identical in the passage, they automatically assume that it has to be correct. This is a relatively effective way to deal with such a bad mentality that can potentially cost you a lot of points. Let's move on to the very first question of today. Just as always, pause the video here if you want to give it a try, and we'll go straight into discussion. This passage is exactly 100 words, which is definitely manageable, but it has a lot of scary vocabulary. This is a perfect opportunity to be dumb and practice reading comprehension without knowing what those words actually mean. I'll use the first sentence as an example. This sentence can be nicely separated into 3 components, with the middle one being has to be. The part before it is the subject, and I will make a wild assumption that you at least know the words learning and teaching. The whole part put together is more about how learning and teaching is carried out, but you can see that omitting the approach to the methodology part does not alter the interpretation in general. The part behind has to be is a parallelism with 3 components. Comprehensive is the only word in the first parallel term, so not being able to understand this word will lead to some loss of information. However, one thing you should be able to deduce from this word and this word alone is the fact that it is probably positive. Comprehensive is a fancy word for complete and wholesome, which is somewhat connected to the second term in the parallelism. Maybe you don't know what explicit and transparent mean. Even though I think you should at least know the latter, the structure tells you that the more important part is presenting all options. The trailing bit is just some extra info on how to present all options. The last term in the parallelism uses some super scary words, but if you happen to know what avoiding means, which again, I think you should, you will be able to tell that these words mean bad things. What they exactly are literally doesn't concern you. They are just bad things you should avoid. So a pretty good understanding of the first sentence without much loss of actual info is the following. I dare you to tell me that you can fail to understand this. The next sentence can be simplified as well, albeit using a different approach. Let's take a look at its composition. It generally follows the structure. It is ... that ... Whenever you see a sentence phrased like this, you can bet money on the fact that the more important part is behind that. It has been our fundamental methodological principle that basically serves a very simple purpose to tell you that the upcoming part is important and nothing more. You will literally lose nothing if you just ignore these 8 words altogether. Next up, the bit behind that. The methods to be employed in language learning, teaching, and research can just be summarized as the methods, simply because we know the other parts are not the main components of the sentence. This sentence, ignoring the parts before that, which we have already discussed and decided to do so, has the core structure. The methods are those ... and the parts we have removed simply tell you what the methods actually are. The teaching methods, the learning methods, and the research methods. They are not necessarily difficult words per se, but structurally speaking, they are still not as important as the solo word methods. Then we have considered to be most effective, and we can basically stop here. I mean it. Everything that comes after just explains in what way it is the most effective. If we choose to break it down, it literally consists of 5 prepositional phrases, one right behind another, with some past parts added to some prepositions. And that's it. To sum it up, this sentence simply means we have to adopt the most effective methods for teaching, learning, and researching, but being most effective comes with conditions. Namely, in reaching the objectives agreed in the light of the needs of the individual learners in the social context. If I were to give a simpler version of this long piece of text, it would probably be the methods have to be effective to achieve the goals of the students determined by the society. Again, the core message is the first half. The second half is just some extra detail. The last sentence talks about the effectiveness, and right away you run into another difficult word, contingent. Here's another trick. Swap out unfamiliar adjectives with this, or, are you ready for this? Something. It does a nice job as a placeholder so you can focus more on the analysis of the structure. So, effectiveness is a word on the motivations and characteristics, 2 words that you definitely should know, and then you should be able to come to the conclusion that effectiveness is positively related to motivations and characteristics because they are all more or less positive terms. This is an extension from distinguishing the tone of the author, which we will also come across later on. Then you have the phrase as well as, which tells you it's another form of a parallelism. For the last part, by now you should have no problem to see that the nature of the human and material resources is way more important than which can be brought into play, and that's the whole passage. We have simplified it quite a bit without diving too deep into the individual words, which is a good thing. You might be wondering, why do we get to drop so much info from the original passage? The answer is simple. The question is asking for the point that the author is trying to make. Whatever point he was to talk about, it cannot and will not only lie in the details. It has to be the core message, which will definitely be delivered by the core structures. Write this down and memorize this by heart. It will come in very handy countless times in the near future. Let's go through the options. The first one is obviously wrong because the passage has said nothing about the intelligence of people, let alone its comparison with motivation. Do not jump to the conclusion that a passage about education and learning will be talking about intellect. That would be adding in your subjective interpretation, which you should never do. The second option can be eliminated as well because whatever insinuation the passage may have on intelligence, it definitely said nothing about play. Could play be one of the effective methods of learning? It's definitely possible, but again, it's not directly mentioned in the passage, so it will never be the right answer. That leaves us with 2 options. Once you reach this stage, you can choose to make a quick guess and move on if you happen to run low on time, which should not be a common situation if you manage it well throughout the reading section in the first place. We can quickly eliminate the last option, making the third the correct one. Simple reasoning once again. You might think the passage is talking to teachers or there are at least some references to them, but they are not mentioned directly anywhere in the text. You can put on a better argument that the passage said nothing about constant change, but usually making the cut at teachers is good enough of a strategy, and it's definitely a lot easier to carry out than to have a full understanding of the passage, don't you agree? This is a true single answer because we have found only one correct option. Let's move on to the second one. This passage is slightly longer, but the concepts and involved vocabulary are arguably less daunting than the last one. The question asks for which statements are true, which kinda gives it away that this is a choose multiple answers. Doesn't matter, we will still analyze the text first and then go through the options one by one. The first sentence gives a general idea of what the adaptations actually are. The second sentence tells you that there are different types. Even though it only tells you there are 2, you should be able to tell from the following sentences that there are actually 3: structural, behavioral, and physiological. The sentences each explain what they are and gave some examples. So far so good. We can just substitute these words with A, B, and C and just remember the fact that there are 3 different types. The last 2 sentences will take some time to go through. The first sentence has something that trips up students quite frequently, the passive voice. It might need some clarifications. When using a passive voice, the subject is no longer the thing or person doing the action. The action is being done to the subject. To put it in the context of the passage, Natural selection selects the traits as adaptations, not the other way around. Being able to recognize and distinguish active and passive voices is so crucial to the point that not having this ability will directly cause you to misjudge many options, because you will constantly get confused about the message being told by the text. The last sentence begins with the underlying genetic basis for the adaptive trait. Take a look at how I was able to isolate this part. These are the words that came before the predicate did not arise, which is made up of two verbs and an adverb. It has everything to do with the parts of speech of different words, so learn how to use this to your advantage. This bit has some scary words, but we have seen the word trait in the previous sentence, so you can basically assume that it is still about the trait, and this sentence is an elaboration of the previous one. This is not too risky of an assumption because this is oftentimes how the writing works. The repeated use of some words can often tell you that they are the main concept being discussed and expanded upon. After the predicate did not arise, you have once again two prepositional phrases. Consequence is a word that you should know, and combining with the negative phrasing of the predicate, this sentence precisely means these traits are not the consequences. Then you have a semicolon, which is basically a variant of the period. It is used to tell you that even though it separates two complete sentences, they are connected via meaning, hence the use of a semicolon. The last part has two prefixes that we should understand, the pre and the sub. Pre, just as in prefix, means before, and sub, just as in suffix, which is a variant, means after or below. Putting the two parts together, the main message of the last bit of the text is trying to tell you that the traits that happen to help creatures adapt are not made by the environment. Instead, they exist beforehand, hence the word pre-existed, and subsequently, meaning coming after the sequence of events being chosen by the environment. We're almost done. We have one more subordinate clause to discuss. The word because is a conjunction, so it supports another full sentence. Structurally speaking, the message it entails is important, since if this isn't the case, it will probably be written using a preposition or a smaller clause. It explains why some traits are picked, and the reason is that they give some advantages. Good stuff. That concludes the passage. Let's look at the options. The first one, as we talked about at the beginning, is definitely correct, suggesting that there are three different types of adaptations. You just have to do a simple match and check to see that the given three words are the exact words used in the passage. The second option is incorrect for the very simple reason that the passage only introduces the different types without talking about which being more common than others. Again, do not make any assumptions that are not explicitly said in the text. The third option is also incorrect because these genes are not new. They already existed as different traits, being heavily emphasized with the word pre-existed. We're down to the last two. The fourth option is correct, even though it didn't use the original word in the text. The text used advantage, and the option says benefits. This is possibly the most complex of a substitution among synonyms you can expect. Not too difficult to see that they mean the same thing. The last option is incorrect because the sequence of events is being reversed. Traits are not created by the environment with the purpose to increase the chance of survival. Rather, they existed in different varieties already, and some happened to be better for survival, so they were chosen. You have two correct options, 1 and 4. Easy. You ready for question 3? Here we go. Another short one, but arguably more difficult than the first question. Let's look at the prompt first. We are supposed to summarize the author's opinion, which saves us a lot of trouble. I have no idea what war requiem is, being the uncultured swine that I am, but thanks to the question, I don't have to know what it is. I have a vague sense that it is something related to music, simply because I know the words chorus, soloist, and orchestra, nothing else. However, in the consistent spirit of us simplifying these passages, you can stop after figuring out that it's a piece of work. Be it a poem, novel, symphony, painting, doesn't really matter. We're looking for the author's opinion, so in this case the adjectives start to play a much more important role. Looking at the first sentence, we see the adjectives flawed and impressive, both very common words. The conjunction but in between tells you that they have somewhat opposite meanings, so the author obviously has some conflicted opinion about this piece of work. Notice how I just completely ignored the dude's name, jumped over when this war requiem is being composed, and even stopped saying war requiem when I can use the substitute a piece of work. This simplification is more in your mindset, so get a good feel of this so you can employ this strategy when doing these questions yourself. The next sentence mentions how the piece of work weaves together a few things, which I really don't care about. Here's why. We're looking for an opinion, and how the piece of work was composed is purely factual. Once again, I have no idea what ptemaxed is or who Wilfred Owen was, apart from the fact that he was an officer who died in World War I, so you know as much about this dude as I do, if not more. The point is, it doesn't matter at all. The third sentence is even more description about the meaning and purpose of this piece of work, which, again, I know nothing about. It tells me something about war and deaths, but there's not much opinion here, so objectively speaking, it is useless to us. The next sentence focuses on the prodigal inconsistencies in the piece of work made by the dude, which is somewhat opinionated and links back to how the author thinks of the piece of work as flawed. But that's as much as we can get out of this part. In contrast, the last sentence seems to be quite important, for all its problems nicely correlates with the first sentence where we saw the word flawed, so the author obviously thinks that this piece of work has not achieved perfection. The rest of the sentence focuses on how this piece of work will survive through time, but what embodiment it will survive as is beyond my comprehension and interest. Let's go through the options now. The first one is definitely incorrect. The author did talk about how weaving plays a part in composing the piece of work, but he has never voiced his opinion about this method of creation, but only about the work itself. The second option is something that he explicitly talked about, even though it doesn't sound like the whole opinion. We'll keep this one for now and see if there is a better option. The third option seems to be very fitting to our interpretation. The author admires the piece of work but thinks it is far from perfect. This leads to a very important observation. Occasionally, you will run into options that are not incorrect by itself, but if they are a part of a better and more complete answer, then the former is wrong. This is exactly the case here for the second option. He is being critical to the inconsistencies and flaws in this piece of work, but he still finds it impressive and thinks it will survive through time. The last option is clearly incorrect for the reason we just talked about. This is a true single answer. Whew! This has taken us quite a while. We went through 3 reading multiple choice questions in detail while strategically avoiding the difficult words. However, whichever words you see and don't understand in PTE questions are probably useful and common, so I will start amending this series with episodes to collect and discuss these vocabularies. I will talk about their meaning, but more importantly, discuss how they differ with synonyms and demonstrate with examples how I would use them myself. The crash course and walkthrough videos will be dedicated purely to the questions, which I think is a very nice structure. That'll be all for today. Hope you have learned some useful tips when approaching reading multiple choice questions. Please like, subscribe, and share, and the walkthrough with more questions is coming up real soon. Please don't quote a white supremacist when talking about racial equality, and I'll see you all next time.